Hey everyone, I'm Shah. In this video, I'm going to discuss how to create a custom MCP server and connect it to ChatGPT. I'll start by reviewing key MCP concepts and then go through a concrete example with code. So at this point, you're probably familiar with the Model Context Protocol, or MCP for short. But just to recap, MCP is a standard way to connect tools to AI applications. You may have already seen MCP in action when using tools like ChatGPT or Claude, where you can integrate it with apps like Notion, Gmail, Google Calendar, Google Drive, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, what this enables is for you to connect your favorite tools like Notion and the like to your favorite AI applications. However, a more recent feature of apps like ChatGPT and Claude is that you can now integrate them with custom tools. For example, you could create an MCP server that allows ChatGPT to access YouTube transcripts given a video's URL. And since MCP is an open standard, if you build a MCP server that works with ChatGPT, it will instantly work with other apps like Claude. Building this MCP server and connecting it to ChatGPT is exactly what we're going to do in this video. But first, to give a bit more background on how MCP works, it uses a so-called client-server architecture, which is pretty standard in the web development world. The way this works is you'll have a so-called MCP client, which will live inside an AI app like ChatGPT. The client will send requests to so-called MCP servers. For example, it might ask a server, what tools do you have available? And then the server will send back a response listing all of its available tools. This is the basic communication protocol that allows ChatGPT to access, say, a custom MCP server that gives it access to a set of tools. And then if ChatGPT wants to use one of these tools, it can send a request in a particular format, and then the MCP server will execute that tool call and send back the output. In previous videos, I've shown how to create custom MCP servers and to connect them to things like Claude Desktop or to build custom AI agents with them. However, one thing I have not covered in previous videos is how to set up authorization of an MCP server. In other words, restricting which applications and users can access your server. This is important when creating remote MCP servers. So in other words, servers that are running in the cloud, because these are publicly available on the internet and potentially any application will be able to access your server, and maybe that's not something you want to happen. So to restrict access to your MCP server running on the internet, there are three key concepts we need to know. The first is the MCP server, which is what we've already talked about. So this is the thing being accessed. This could be something like a YouTube MCP server. The next concept is the MCP client, which we've talked about as well. This is the thing requesting access to the MCP server. So this could be something like ChatGPT. But what we haven't talked about is this third concept of an authentication server. This is a third component which is responsible for issuing access tokens after authenticating the client. Just to give you an idea of what this authorization flow can look like, here I'm going to walk through a specific example. Just a warning, this is going to get a little complicated. So if you're not really interested in how this auth flow works, feel free to skip ahead to the example code. So the way this will work is that the MCP client will request access to this protected resource metadata. Basically, the client is asking the server for key information it needs to authenticate itself. So it'll send this request and the MCP server will send some metadata, which will include a link to the authentication server. From there, the client can then request the metadata from the authentication server. Then the server will send back the metadata. We can optionally have this dynamic client registration. Basically, instead of having every single app be pre-configured by the auth server, we can just have this dynamic client registration, which allows any client to register itself with the authentication server using this post request. Then the auth server will return the client credentials. From from here, the client will generate a few things to enable this OAuth flow, and this will open up a little page in the browser so the user can sign into the auth server. Once the user types in their username and password, it'll send this auth request. The server will authorize the user. It'll redirect the user to the callback with the auth code. Then the authorization code will get passed to the client, which can now authorize itself by talking to the auth server. The auth server will give the client an access token, which now enables the MCP client to send a request to the MCP server. The server will respond. So this is essentially like an initial handshake to kick off communication. And then from here, you can have the typical MCP communication. So the client will ask it to list its tools, or maybe it will try to execute tool calls, and then the server will respond accordingly. While this is very complicated and it took me way too long to figure this out and get this working, this is still like a truncated version. So there are actually many different alternative ways this could look. If you're interested in that, you can check out reference number 2, which is the full MCP authorization documentation. Now that we have a basic understanding of MCP and how authorization works with it, let's go through a concrete example of connecting a YouTube MCP server to ChatGPT. So a basic overview of this is we'll have ChatGPT, we'll connect it to our custom MCP server, which will have things like instructions on how to use the server, a tool to fetch YouTube transcripts, and we'll include this OAuth authorization flow. This is going to consist of 4 key steps. The first thing is we're going to create the custom MCP server using the official MCP Python SDK. Then we're going to deploy the server. So here I'm going to use Railway, but of course you can use any hosting platform you like. Then we'll set up the authorization using Auth0, which is a popular service for doing this. Finally, we'll connect our server to ChatGPT. All the code for this example is freely available at the GitHub repository shown here and linked in the description. So to create the MCP server, this is going to be pretty similar to content we've seen in past videos of creating local MCP servers with a couple of tweaks. And so the first thing we'll do is import some environment variables. So we'll import OS and the python.env library to load environment variables. We'll import a couple things from the official MCP Python SDK, and then we'll also import this class from Pydantic. With that, we'll load in the environment variables from the .env file. You'll use the .env file if running this locally, but if running this remotely, we're going to use a secrets manager, which we'll see later in Railway. But basically, this is going to make available to the Python code all the environment variables. So we'll have a few different environment variables, including this auth0 domain, as well as this resource server URL. The auth0 domain is basically the URL of the authentication server, and this resource server URL is going to be the URL of our MCP server. And then I also have this markdown file called server instructions saved in the repo, and this is, as the name suggests, instructions for using the MCP server. So this is going to get passed to the AI application whenever it is connected to it. The next thing we're going to do is create this JSON web token verifier that's defined in this separate file called auth.py, and there's just this function called create auth0 verifier. And so I'm not going to go through the code here because it's quite long, but the code's really available on GitHub. Also, you can probably find implementations for doing this on the web, or just have your favorite coding agent write it for you. But the purpose of this function is to take the token that is provided to the MCP server by the MCP client and to ensure that it is valid by checking it with auth0. Once we have all these things in place, we can create our MCP server using this fast MCP class. We have a few inputs here. So the first is the server name. The next are the server instructions. Next, we can specify the host. Here I put 0000, and that's just because Railway was defaulting to 127.0.0.1, which doesn't allow external access. So I just changed it to this. Then we have our token verifier we saw in the previous slide. And then then we'll use this auth settings class from the MCP Python SDK, and then we'll pass in a few inputs here. So we have this issuer URL. So this is the URL of our auth server. We have the resource server URL. So this is the URL of our MCP server running on Railway, and then required scopes. Initially, I tried doing this without scopes, and that worked fine with Claude, but when I was trying to connect to ChatGPT, it wasn't working. So it seems, at least at this point, ChatGPT requires you to explicitly write out all the scopes for the MCP server. So I just listed them all here. Then the final thing we can do is actually add tools to the MCP server. We do this by writing out whatever tool we want the LLM to have access to and frame it as a Python function, and then just simply add this mcp.tool decorator to that Python function. So again, I'm not going to go through all this code here because it's all on the GitHub, and I've also shown how to implement this MCP server in at least 2 of my previous YouTube videos. And so I'll link those in the description for those who are curious. Now that we've created our MCP server, the next thing we want to do is deploy it to Railway. And so this is going to consist of 4 key steps. So we'll push the code to GitHub, we'll create a new project in Railway, then we'll deploy the MCP server from GitHub, and then we'll finally add environment variables to our deployment. And so here we have the GitHub repo with the code for this project. Again, this is linked in the description, but we can see the source code here in main.py. This is everything that we were just talking about. And then we have this utils folder with the auth token verifier class, and then the function create auth0 verifier. To deploy this to Railway, you can use whatever hosting platform you like. I just like Railway because that's what I use on my other projects. You can see I already have this YouTube MCP remote project set up, but to create a new one, you can just click new, and then you can click on this GitHub repository. And then here, if you've set up your GitHub account, you'll see all your different GitHub repos listed here. And so you can just click on the GitHub repo that you want to set up. Once you deploy your server, you'll see something like this. That means your MCP server is now running on Railway. But when you first deploy it, it's not actually going to work out of the box. That's because we have to set up these environment variables. So here there are a few necessary environment variables. There's this auth0 domain, which we'll talk about in a second. There's this auth0 audience, and then there's this resource server URL. So in this case, I made the auth0 audience and the resource server URL the same thing. This is just going to be the URL to our Railway project, followed by /MCP. So you can find this if you go to your architecture, and it's this link here. So you can just click on this. This will go to nowhere. But if you add /MCP to it, you'll see that you'll hit the MCP server. But of course, you're going to get an error because we're not authenticated. So it's just telling us authentication is required. And so you can get that URL, and then you can just paste that here. So we'll talk about the auth0 domain in a second, but you'll notice that there are these 3 other environment variables. These aren't relevant to MCP. This is actually needed for fetching the YouTube transcripts. And that's just because if our MCP server running on Railway tries to fetch transcripts from YouTube, YouTube is going to block that request, presumably because YouTube got a lot of requests like this from the Railway domains. So now they just block any requests that look similar. I'm just using this proxy service so that the YouTube transcript library I'm using actually works. But again, this is not relevant to MCP. So if you're creating an MCP server that doesn't fetch YouTube transcripts, then you won't need these. You'll just need these 3 environment variables here. So let's talk about setting up this auth0 domain. I'm going to come back to the slides. So to set up auth, first we're going to create this tenant and add the domain to the environment variables. Then we'll create an API and configure its settings. Next, we'll set the default audience for the tenant, and there's a specific reason for this. Then we'll enable this dynamic client registration so that any AI app can connect to our auth server without being pre-configured. Finally, we will promote the database to domain level to enable the DCR to actually work. Here I'm using auth0, which is just a solution for setting up these auth flows. They have a free tier, and so does Railway. They both have free tiers. So you should be able to get things set up without paying anything. But when you sign up, you'll be prompted to create a tenant. I've got mine set up. It's called YouTube MCP Remote. You can set whatever name you want and whatever region you want when creating your tenant. This tenant name is what we're going to use in this environment variable over here on Railway. So for the auth0 domain, we'll actually have our tenant name dot whatever region we specified for our tenant, followed by .auth0.com. So that's just going to go here. The next thing we want to do is create an API. So we'll go to this applications APIs option, and then we'll hit create API. Here you want to give your API a name. You want to specify an identifier. Here I used just my Railway URL. So this is where the MCP server is hosted, followed by MCP. I left it as auth0 for the JWT profile, and then I left the signing algorithm as RS256. From here, you just hit create, but I've already done that. The next thing we'll need to do is to go to settings. These will be our tenant level settings, and go to this general tab. And then we'll need to scroll down to this API authorization settings and set our default audience. We'll need to set this as our API's identifier. And this is important because of some technical detail. Basically, ChatGPT requests this audience parameter, but what the authorization server will send back by default is a resource parameter. So there's just like a mismatch between the communication protocol. And so by setting the default audience to this, you can get things to work. Figuring this out took a lot of trial and error, but I eventually found this forum where this auth0 employee was explaining the situation and this specific workaround. I'll link this forum in the description if you want to take a look at it. And then again, this needs to match the auth0 audience that you put in your environment variables. And then there's one other thing we'll have to do at the tenant level, which is scroll down to settings and enable dynamic client registration. And so again, this is going to allow ChatGPT and Claude or whatever other AI application to register themselves with the auth server, so we don't have to preset them up in auth0. And then there's one last thing we need to do, which is go to authentication and click on database. We'll have this database that's created for us automatically. So we'll just click on this. And to get DCR to actually work, we have to click this promote connection to domain level option. Another thing you can do is disable signups. So only users who are registered to your auth server can access the MCP server. What I did is I initially had this off. Once I had the MCP server connected, I was able to sign in. And then after I was added as a user, I turned it on so no one else can sign in. Alternatively, you can just disable signups from the jump and then just manually add users on this user page here. That's everything we needed to do to set up auth0. I know it was a lot of steps, but it took me like 2 days to figure this out. So hopefully this takes you less than 2 days. The last thing we can do is finally connect our MCP server to ChatGPT. So this is gonna require a few steps. We'll first put ChatGPT into developer mode, and that's just because adding custom connectors to ChatGPT is still in beta, so you'll need to go into developer mode to do this. And this is actually only available to Plus and Pro users. So I'm sorry if you're a free user, but I imagine this will soon be rolled out to free users. Then we'll create a new connector. Then we'll sign in to our auth server. Then we'll connect our MCP server to ChatGPT, and then we'll actually use our MCP server. Here we are in ChatGPT. We'll go to settings, then we'll click on apps and connectors, and then we'll scroll all the way down to advanced settings, and then we'll just enable developer mode. Once we do this, we'll see our ChatGPT looks different and memory is not used in developer mode. Then we'll go back to settings and we'll click on apps and connectors, and then we'll just click on this create button. Here we will give our connector a name. So I'll call it YouTube MCP. We can give it a description. So I'll say fetch YouTube video transcripts given URLs. Then we'll provide the link to our MCP server URL. And so again, this is just the URL for the Railway app followed by /MCP. Then we have authentication as OAuth, and then hit I understand and want to continue. And so this is just saying if you're connecting to third-party MCP servers, just be cautious because they can of course steal your data or trick the model into doing things that you aren't aware of them doing. But I trust this server because I created it, so I'm just going to hit create. Now it'll kick off this OAuth flow. So if it's your first time signing in, you won't see this screen. You'll instead see like a sign up or a login screen that'll take a username and password. You can just use that to sign up for the auth server, and then you'll see a page like this. And so it's just just saying what the required scopes are, which we already know about. So we'll just hit accept. And so now we see YouTube MCP is now connected. I'll just hit connect. And so it just gives a little modal here, and I'll just say continue to YouTube MCP. And so now it's connected. Here we'll see a bunch of information about the MCP server, and we'll see the actions listed. So there's a fetch instructions tool and fetch video transcript tool. But the cool thing now is if we go to ChatGPT, I'm gonna say something like get the transcript for this video. And then this is a link to a previous video on building custom agents with MCP servers. So if we hit send, ChatGPT is going to say something like, I'm sorry, Shah, but I can't provide a full transcript of the video since it's copyrighted material. So basically, if you try to have ChatGPT do this without any tools, it's not going to be able to do it. But to actually get it to use the MCP server, we'll just do at YouTube MCP server, click on this, and we'll try it again. Now it's looking for tools, and now it's trying to call a tool. We have this little UI that is telling us what tool ChatGPT is trying to call. So I'll just say confirm. Now it's executing the tool call, and here we go. So how to build your custom AI agent with MCP by Shah, and then it's listing out the transcript, but it's really long, so it doesn't want to write it all out, but then it's suggesting things that it can do with it. So now we're all set up. If you made it this far, then congratulations. You now know how to create and connect a custom MCP server to ChatGPT. And again, because MCP is an open standard, this doesn't just work on ChatGPT. You can easily just go to Claude, go to their connectors interface, do add custom connector and do something similar, link the server and click add. And now this MCP server is all set up on Claude as well. So we can take this, paste the same exact request and see what happens. You see the UI is slightly different, but it's executing the same tool call. And then you can see that it got the response. We actually can see the full response from the tool. Now it's nicely formatted, which is pretty cool. And so the interface is a bit smoother for Claude because one, it's not in beta, and then you don't have to specifically tag the MCP server you want to use. You can just enable it in these options here. But that's the cool thing about MCP. You just build the thing once and it's automatically compatible with all the most popular AI applications. So in this video, we saw how to build, deploy, and connect a custom MCP server to ChatGPT in Claude. If you have any questions or suggestions for future content, please let me know in the comment section below. And as always, thank you so much for your time and thanks for watching.